I've worked here 22 years. His colleague looked at him. Have you ever seen leadership this nervous? He slowly shook his head. Never. By afternoon, the whispers had reached airport terminals across the country. Pilots heard them in briefing rooms. Cabin crews discussed them between flights. Ground staff exchanged quiet observations while loading baggage. The question was no longer whether changes were coming, it was who would still have an office when they arrived. For the first time in years, positions once considered untouchable suddenly felt uncertain. The approaching storm had not yet arrived, but everyone inside the airline could already feel the pressure changing. The approaching storm had not yet arrived, but everyone inside the airline could already feel the pressure changing. Late that afternoon, the airline's CEO entered the executive conference room without an escort. Nobody greeted him. Nobody expected a speech. He quietly took his seat and looked around the table. Stacks of reports waited before him. Media summaries, legal assessments, financial forecasts. He opened the first folder, read 2 pages, closed it again. The chairman finally asked, "Would you like an update?" The CEO nodded once. "Go ahead." For 20 minutes, department heads explained falling confidence, investor concerns, government inquiries, and growing public criticism. He interrupted no one. When the final presentation ended, silence settled over the room. Everyone waited. The communications officer leaned forward. "We should hold another press conference." The CEO looked at her calmly. No. The legal director suggested another public statement. He received the same answer. No. The chief operating officer spoke carefully. "Then what do we do?" The CEO folded his hands. "We listen." Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. The chairman frowned. "People expect leadership." They do. "And they expect action." They do. "Then why stay silent?" The CEO looked toward the paused image of Marcus Ellison displayed on the screen. "Because empty promises sound louder than honest responsibility." Nobody answered. He slowly stood and walked to the window overlooking the headquarters entrance. Reporters filled the sidewalk below. Camera crews waited patiently. The CEO spoke without turning around. "We cannot repair trust by talking faster." He paused. "We repair it by changing faster." The room remained completely still. For the first time that day, no executive offered another presentation, another slogan, or another carefully rehearsed explanation. The CEO signed 2 internal documents and handed them to his assistant. She glanced at the pages, then looked up in surprise. He simply nodded. His quiet decisions carried more weight than any speech the company could have delivered. Everyone understood the same painful truth. Time was no longer working for the airline. It was quietly working against it, and every passing hour made rebuilding public confidence even more difficult. Before anyone left the conference room, every conversation returned to the same name: Marcus Ellison. No one discussed his title anymore. No one questioned his credentials. The only question remaining was painfully simple. What would he do next? Across the city, Marcus sat inside his office overlooking the skyline. The television remained muted. News anchors continued repeating the story. His assistant entered quietly. "The airline has called 6 times. Marcus looked up from the contract resting on his desk. "I know. They're requesting a meeting." He closed the folder without answering. A senior vice president stepped inside. "The partnership renewal documents are ready." Marcus nodded. "Leave them here." The room became silent again. No anger crossed his face. No satisfaction appeared in his expression. He simply studied the signature page waiting before him. 1 line, 1 signature, 1 decision. His assistant finally spoke. "Everyone is waiting." Marcus looked toward the window. "They're waiting for the wrong thing." She frowned slightly. "They think this is about revenge." "It isn't." "What is it about?" He answered calmly. "It's about accountability." The vice president sat across from him. "If you suspend the agreement, the entire industry will notice." Marcus nodded once. "They should." His assistant hesitated. "Will you sign today?" Marcus rested his hand beside the document, but never touched the pen. "Not until I know whether they've learned anything." Outside his office, financial markets waited. Corporate partners watched. Government officials monitored every development. Inside airline headquarters, executives refreshed their phones every few minutes, hoping for any update. No message arrived. No announcement appeared. The silence became heavier than any public statement. Marcus finally reached for the pen. Everyone watching imagined the next movement would determine the future of one airline. They were only partly correct. The signature would affect far more than a single company. It would become a measure of whether patience, dignity, and quiet restraint could accomplish what outrage never could: Marcus uncapped the pen. Then he paused once more. Before anyone could guess his decision, Marcus uncapped the pen. The room remained completely silent. His assistant watched without speaking. The vice president folded his hands and waited. Marcus read the final page one last time. Then he signed. The ink settled quietly across the document. No applause followed. No celebration, no expression of triumph crossed his face. He handed the agreement back to the vice president. Effective immediately. The executive accepted the folder carefully. "I'll notify legal." Marcus nodded. "Make sure they receive the notice before the media does." "It will be done." His assistant looked at him. "Should we prepare a press conference?" Marcus shook his head. "No." "A public statement?" One sentence. She opened her notebook. He spoke calmly. Ellison Technologies is temporarily suspending its $120 million partnership pending a full independent review of the airline's conduct and corrective actions. She finished writing. "That's all?" Marcus stood and looked through the office window. "That's enough." Within minutes, the official notice reached airline headquarters. The legal director read it twice before passing it across the table. Nobody questioned its authenticity. Nobody searched for hidden conditions. The suspension was lawful. Professional, dart final. The chairman slowly removed his glasses. "So, it's frozen." The chief financial officer lowered his head. "Effective immediately." No one blamed Marcus, even those. Most affected understood the decision had not been driven by anger. He had offered no insults, made no threats, demanded no revenge. He had simply held the company accountable through the authority it had once taken for granted. Across the aviation industry, executives stopped their meetings to read the announcement. Competitors exchanged quiet glances. Business leaders understood exactly what had happened. One calm signature had accomplished what endless public arguments never could. Marcus returned the pen to his desk. His assistant quietly closed the folder. Neither of them spoke again. There was nothing left to prove. The decision had already spoken louder than outrage ever could, reminding everyone watching that dignity, when joined with responsibility, carries a power no public confrontation can ever equal. Before the announcement appeared online, Marcus approved one final draft. He read every sentence carefully, removed unnecessary words, crossed out every phrase that sounded emotional. When he finished, he handed the page back. "This is the one." His communications director reviewed it once more. "No accusations?" "No." "No personal comments?" "None." She smiled faintly. "It says more this way." Within minutes, the statement appeared on the company's official website. Ellison Technologies has suspended its partnership with the airline until independent reforms demonstrate measurable improvements in fairness, accountability, and passenger treatment. Nothing more. Nothing less. News organizations published it immediately. Television anchors paused their debates. Industry analysts reread every line. One aviation consultant quietly admitted he never attacked them. Another replied, he didn't need to. Across the country, airline executives requested emergency meetings. One chief executive asked his compliance officer, "Do we have policies like this?" The answer came after an uncomfortable pause. "I honestly don't know." "Find out." Inside another airline headquarters, diversity officers reopened forgotten reports. Training manuals returned to conference tables. Managers suddenly questioned procedures nobody had challenged before. Marcus's statement had become more than corporate news. It had become a mirror. Meanwhile, inside the original airline's boardroom, silence returned. The chief financial officer projected revised forecasts onto the screen. The partnership suspension alone will cost millions. Nobody reacted. The chairman stared at Marcus's photograph displayed beside the financial report. "We thought he was just another passenger." The legal director answered quietly. "He was our most important partner." Another executive whispered, "And we never even asked his name." Those words settled heavily across the room. The financial loss was enormous. The damage to credibility was greater. For the first time, every executive understood the truth they had avoided since the boarding gate. The man they dismissed had never been powerless. They had simply been too blinded by assumption to recognize the future standing directly in front of them until it quietly walked away. I'll continue seamlessly from the previous section. Morning arrived beneath a sky crowded with satellite dishes instead of clouds. Outside the airline's headquarters, television vans stretched across the entire block. Reporters adjusted microphones, while camera operators searched constantly for movement behind the glass entrance. Every network carried the same question. How had an accomplished black executive been treated like a suspect before anyone bothered learning his identity? Security officers quietly redirected employees through side entrances, hoping to avoid the growing crowd. Most workers lowered their heads. Some recognized familiar reporters calling after them. Do you believe the company failed? Was this really company policy? Has anyone accepted responsibility? No one answered. Inside the lobby, executives watched the live broadcasts from silent television screens. Every headline repeated the same uncomfortable story. Outside, another reporter stepped closer to the camera. The public is no longer asking whether a mistake occurred. They're asking how many warnings were ignored before this incident finally reached the world. Nearby, a longtime passenger stood behind the media barricades. "I've flown this airline for years," he said. "Today I want honesty, not another polished apology." His words spread across every broadcast. Minutes later, another journalist reported, "Sources confirm the airline's leadership remains inside, but no executive has agreed to answer questions." The waiting crowd grew larger. Employees arriving for work slipped through security checkpoints without speaking. Some avoided looking at the cameras altogether. Others glanced briefly toward the microphones before disappearing inside. The silence itself became another headline. Every unanswered question deepened public frustration. Every passing minute reminded viewers that accountability delayed often feels like accountability denied. By midday, the headquarters no longer resembled the confident home of a respected airline. It looked like a building surrounded by unanswered questions, where every closed door suggested the truth should have been discovered long before television cameras ever arrived. The final live broadcast faded from the boardroom television. Nobody reached for the remote. Nobody suggested another strategy. The silence remained. The chairman slowly closed the financial report resting before him. "It isn't only the partnership." No one disagreed. The chief financial officer looked across the table. "We can recover money." He hesitated. "I don't know if we can recover trust." Those words settled heavily over every executive. Phones that had rung endlessly throughout the morning now rested untouched. Presentation slides remained frozen on the conference screen. Graphs. Forecasts, recovery plans. None of them seemed important anymore. The legal director quietly removed his glasses. "We prepared for lawsuits." He sighed deeply. "We never prepared to question ourselves." Across the room, the human resources director opened a folder filled with old complaints. For years, those reports had carried little urgency. Now every page felt impossible to ignore. "They were trying to warn us," she whispered. The chairman nodded slowly. "And we kept calling them isolated incidents." Nobody defended those decisions. Nobody searched for excuses. The weight inside the room had become greater than the $120 million they had just lost. Marcus had not destroyed their company. Their own assumptions had. One executive stared through the boardroom window toward the reporters gathered below. "They're waiting for answers," the chairman answered quietly. "So are we." Another long silence followed. For the first time, every leader understood the crisis had never started at the boarding gate. It had started years earlier. Every ignored complaint, every unanswered letter, every uncomfortable conversation that had ended with protecting procedures instead of protecting people. Those choices had slowly built the culture now collapsing around them. The partnership freeze merely exposed what already existed. The chairman finally stood. "No more hiding behind policies." He looked around the room. "We're not rebuilding an agreement." His voice remained calm. "We're rebuilding our character." Nobody applauded. Nobody objected. Every executive simply lowered their eyes, understanding that restoring dignity would demand far more courage than protecting profits ever had. The silence following his final words seemed heavier than every camera hanging from the ceiling. No reporter interrupted. No executive reached for a prepared statement. For several long seconds, the entire room simply existed inside the weight of what had just been said. Marcus stood at the podium without lowering his eyes. His hands rested lightly on the edges of the lectern. He had not come to defeat anyone. He had come to tell the truth. A reporter finally raised her hand. "Mr. Carter, are you asking for the flight attendant to be fired?" He answered without hesitation. "No." The response surprised the room. "I don't believe one person created this problem. One person carried it out. There's a difference." Several executives shifted uneasily. Marcus continued. "If replacing one employee solved prejudice, this conversation would have ended decades ago." The cameras remained fixed on him. "We have to ask harder questions. Who trained her? What examples did she learn from? How many complaints were ignored before mine? How many people walked away believing the problem was themselves instead of the system? Across the stage, the airline's chief executive slowly removed his glasses. His expression revealed exhaustion more than defense. Marcus looked briefly toward him before facing the audience again. I don't hate that woman. His voice remained calm. I hope she learns. I hope everyone involved learns. Accountability without learning is only punishment. Learning without accountability is only another excuse. A quiet murmur spread through the journalists. Another reporter stood. Do you forgive the airline? Marcus paused. I believe forgiveness follows responsibility. Responsibility begins with honesty. They're taking their first steps today. The airline CEO slowly rose from his chair. I would like to respond. His voice lacked the confidence people associated with corporate leaders. Mr. Carter is right. Every microphone turned toward him. We searched for legal explanations before moral ones. We worried about headlines before people. We defended procedures instead of questioning assumptions. He stopped briefly. For that, I am deeply sorry. No applause followed. The absence of applause said more than cheers ever could. Outside the building, thousands of people watched the broadcast on phones, televisions, office screens, and airport monitors. Conversations quietly replaced arguments. Teachers paused classroom lessons. Managers reconsidered hiring practices. Parents looked thoughtfully at their children. Former passengers exchanged messages that began with the same words. I thought I was the only one. The story no longer belonged to Marcus alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever doubted themselves because someone else questioned where they belonged. Inside the conference hall, Marcus stepped away from the podium. He nodded politely toward the executives, then toward the reporters. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply walked toward the exit with the same quiet dignity he had carried onto the aircraft days earlier. This time, no one questioned whether he belonged. No one asked to see another boarding pass. The cameras followed him until the doors closed gently behind him, leaving the room filled not with victory, but with reflection. The television screen faded to a wider shot of the stage, yet his final words refused to leave her mind. She stood frozen in the middle of her small apartment, remote still resting in her hand, while the silence pressed against every wall. The room had never seemed this empty before. She looked toward her phone on the kitchen counter. Nothing. No calls from coworkers. No messages from supervisors. No friends asking how she was holding up. For years, her schedule had been full of flight updates, crew messages, and travel plans. Now, the screen remained dark. She whispered to herself, I never imagined it would end like this. The sentence disappeared into the quiet. She walked to the window overlooking the parking lot below. Cars came and went as if nothing had changed. Neighbors carried groceries inside. Children laughed somewhere across the street. Life continued. Only hers seemed to have stopped. Behind her, the television replayed part of the press conference. I didn't lose my seat because of policy. She quickly lowered the volume but did not turn it off. His voice had become impossible to escape. She sat on the edge of the couch and covered her face with both hands. I was just doing my job, she whispered. The words sounded weaker than they had yesterday. Another thought answered almost immediately. Were you? She remembered raising her hand to stop him, the calm expression on his face, the expensive suit. The boarding pass he offered without argument. He had never shouted. He had never insulted her. He had simply trusted that showing the truth would be enough. She swallowed hard. It should have been enough. Tears gathered before she realized she was crying. She reached for a framed photograph sitting beside the television. It showed her smiling with her flight crew after completing their first international route together. Everyone looked proud. She remembered believing they represented professionalism at its best. Now she wondered how many passengers had smiled politely while carrying pain she never noticed. The apartment remained painfully still. For the first time since boarding that flight, there were no announcements, no passengers, no coworkers, and no policies standing between her and her own conscience. Only silence, and it was louder than the crowded cabin she once believed she controlled. The silence inside her apartment remained with her long after the television screen went dark. Miles away, that same silence had settled inside airline headquarters, though it carried a very different meaning. This time, it belonged to accountability. The following Monday, unfamiliar faces walked through the building carrying slim folders instead of company laptops. Independent investigators paused outside office doors that had remained closed to uncomfortable questions for years. One investigator looked toward the human resources director. We'll need every complaint filed during the last 10 years. She nodded immediately. You'll have full access. No exceptions? No exceptions. They began opening archived cabinets untouched for years. Dust-covered forgotten folders. Inside them waited handwritten passenger letters, internal emails, anonymous employee reports, and recommendations marked for future review that had quietly disappeared into storage. One investigator stopped reading and looked across the table. How was this never investigated? A former compliance officer lowered his eyes. We handled each complaint separately. The investigator answered calmly. That was the mistake. Another folder revealed nearly identical concerns from different airports. Passengers describing assumptions, employees reporting uncomfortable patterns, managers recommending additional training that never arrived. Slowly, isolated incidents transformed into one unmistakable timeline. Nothing about the evidence suggested coincidence anymore. It revealed a culture that had grown comfortable dismissing warning signs before they became public embarrassment. Down the hallway, executive offices stood open for the first time in years. Large framed photographs disappeared from polished walls. Personal awards were wrapped in newspaper. The former chairman quietly placed family pictures inside a small cardboard box. No farewell gathering waited outside his office. No applause, no speeches. Employees watched silently as he carried the box toward the elevator. Another senior executive followed minutes later with only a briefcase and one framed certificate. Neither man blamed anyone. Neither attempted another explanation. Their authority had ended far more quietly than it had begun. Inside the main conference room, the newly appointed leadership team met with employees instead of reporters. The new chief executive stood without notes. We are not here to defend what happened. He looked around the room. We are here to understand why it happened. No polished slogans appeared on the screen behind him. Only one image, the paused frame, showing Marcus Ellison standing calmly with his boarding pass. We will study this moment, he continued, not to assign blame, but to understand how ordinary assumptions become institutional failures. Training sessions replaced routine meetings across every department. Pilots, cabin crews, gate agents, executives. Everyone returned to classrooms. The discussion rarely centered on policies alone. Instead, instructors repeatedly asked one simple question. What assumption entered the conversation before respect did? The room usually became quiet. That silence mattered. Weeks later, the airline released another public statement. It accepted responsibility without mentioning one employee by name. It acknowledged years of ignored warnings. It admitted the deepest failure had never been one decision aboard one flight. It had been a culture that allowed suspicion to arrive before dignity. For the first time, the company stopped protecting its image. It started rebuilding its character. Months passed, and the frantic news coverage slowly disappeared from television screens. Headlines changed. New stories replaced old ones. Yet inside universities across the country, the incident refused to fade. One business school introduced it as a required leadership case study. Students filled a large lecture hall while a projector displayed a single photograph of Marcus Ellison standing quietly beside the first-class boarding gate. The professor walked to the front without opening his notes. Today, he began, we are not studying an airline. He paused. We are studying leadership. The room became silent. A student raised her hand. Is this about crisis management? The professor smiled gently. No. Another student asked, corporate reputation? No. He looked around the classroom. It's about what happens long before a crisis ever begins. The photograph remained on the screen. No executive woke up that morning intending to lose $120 million. Heads slowly nodded. They lost something much greater before they lost the contract. He pointed toward Marcus's image. They lost the ability to recognize dignity before making assumptions. Several students began writing. The professor continued walking between the rows. Most leadership failures don't begin with dramatic decisions. His voice remained calm. They begin with ordinary habits nobody questions. He stopped beside one student. A quick assumption, another step, an ignored complaint. Another. A policy followed without reflection. The room stayed completely focused. A student near the back quietly asked, so the financial loss wasn't the real lesson? The professor answered immediately. Money revealed the failure. He looked again at the photograph. It didn't create it. Another student spoke softly. If someone had simply asked one respectful question. The professor finished her thought. None of this might have happened. Silence returned. Not uncomfortable silence, thoughtful silence, the kind that changes people before they ever hold positions of authority. The professor closed the presentation. I hope each of you remembers this. He looked around the lecture hall one final time. Your greatest leadership decision may happen long before anyone realizes you're making one. Nobody rushed to pack their bags. For several quiet moments, every student remained seated, understanding they had learned something far more valuable than another business strategy. The lecture ended, but its lesson continued traveling far beyond the classroom walls. Months later, Marcus Ellison arrived at another airport before sunrise. There were no television crews waiting outside the terminal, no reporters followed his footsteps, no strangers whispered his name while pointing at their phones. The world had finally grown quiet again. He carried only a leather briefcase and the same calm confidence that had always belonged to him long before anyone knew his story. Inside the terminal, travelers hurried towards security checkpoints, coffee shops, and departure gates. The familiar sounds of rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and distant conversations blended into an ordinary morning. For the first time in months, he welcomed the ordinary. His assistant glanced at him. You could use the private terminal if you wanted. Marcus smiled gently. I've never needed distance from people. She nodded without replying. They reached the gate together. He looked down at the boarding pass resting comfortably in his hand. It no longer reminded him of humiliation. It reminded him of resilience. Nearby passengers barely noticed him. That felt strangely comforting. No one expected a speech. No one expected another headline. An elderly traveler accidentally brushed his shoulder. I'm sorry, the man said. Marcus smiled warmly. No harm done. The man smiled back before continuing toward his seat. The exchange lasted only seconds, yet it carried something priceless. Normal respect. No assumptions, no suspicion, just two strangers sharing ordinary kindness. Marcus looked through the large terminal windows as another aircraft lifted into the morning sky. Healing, he realized, had never been waiting inside courtrooms, contracts, or public apologies. It arrived quietly through simple moments where dignity no longer needed permission, recognition, or applause to exist. He adjusted his jacket, walked calmly toward the boarding line, and waited his turn with everyone else, completely at peace. When boarding finally began, Marcus joined the line without drawing attention to himself. The gate agent scanned his boarding pass with a pleasant smile, and he stepped forward toward the aircraft door feeling lighter than he had in many months. Nothing about the morning suggested history would repeat itself. A young flight attendant welcomed the first passenger. Good morning. Welcome aboard. She smiled just as warmly at the next traveler. Then another. When Marcus reached the doorway, she looked directly into his eyes. Good morning, sir. Welcome aboard. Your seat is on the left. Please let me know if you need anything during the flight. Her tone matched every greeting before his. No hesitation, no second glance, no searching expression, only simple respect. Marcus thanked her quietly. Thank you. She nodded with the same kindness she offered everyone else before greeting the family walking behind him. Watching her continue, Marcus noticed something remarkable. She never changed her expression based on expensive clothing. She never hurried elderly passengers. She patiently answered questions from nervous travelers. She smiled at children, business executives, students, and airport workers exactly the same way. Fairness had become natural. It no longer looked like a carefully practiced company policy. It looked like character. An older woman struggled lifting a small suitcase into the overhead compartment. Without waiting to be asked, the flight attendant stepped forward. I've got it. She placed the bag safely above the seat. The woman smiled gratefully. You're very kind. It's my pleasure, the attendant replied. Marcus settled into his seat and watched quietly. No cameras recorded these moments. No headlines would celebrate them. Yet they mattered. Real change was rarely announced with dramatic speeches. Sometimes it appeared through ordinary habits repeated consistently until dignity became the first thing every passenger received, before assumptions ever had the chance to arrive. She smiled naturally. Welcome aboard, sir. The words lasted only a moment. Yet Marcus felt something inside him become unexpectedly still. There was no pause before the greeting, no uncertain expression searching his face, no request to verify where he belonged, no invisible question waiting behind polite language, only respect offered before judgment had any chance to appear. He returned the smile. Thank you. I hope you have a comfortable flight. I'm sure I will. She continued down the aisle, greeting every passenger with the same steady kindness. Marcus watched quietly. Nothing about her behavior suggested performance. She wasn't trying to correct history. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She simply treated every person as though dignity belonged to them before anything else did. The simplicity of that truth carried surprising weight. He rested his briefcase beneath the seat and looked around the cabin. Passengers settled comfortably. Children laughed softly. A businessman searched for headphones. An elderly couple discussed vacation plans. Nobody stared at him. Nobody questioned him. Nobody wondered whether he deserved the seat printed on his boarding pass. For the first time in longer than he cared to remember, the journey began without interruption. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. Success had never been what he truly wanted people to recognize. Not the awards, not the titles, not the wealth. Only his humanity. The aircraft door closed with a gentle sound. Outside, the morning sun reflected across the runway. Inside, ordinary kindness quietly replaced an extraordinary memory. Marcus opened his eyes again and smiled to himself. Respect, he realized, should never feel remarkable. It should always arrive first, like a simple greeting, like two ordinary words. Welcome aboard. Nothing more, nothing less. Exactly as every human being deserves, every single time they travel anywhere together. Marcus fastened his seatbelt and placed his hands quietly on the armrests. Around him, passengers continued settling into their seats, storing bags overhead, exchanging brief conversations, and preparing for another routine journey. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary. He glanced across the cabin without searching for familiar faces. There was nothing left to confront, nothing left to prove. The apology from the airline had mattered. The investigations had mattered. The policy changes had mattered. But as he watched the young flight attendant patiently help a father calm his frightened daughter before takeoff, he understood something even more important. Real change never survives because of headlines alone. It survives because ordinary people make better choices when nobody is watching. The father smiled gratefully. "Thank you." "It's no trouble at all," she replied. Marcus looked toward the window as airport workers guided another aircraft across the runway. The world kept moving. That was exactly how healing should look. Not dramatic, not perfect, steady. A businessman nearby accidentally dropped several papers onto the floor. Without hesitation, another passenger bent down to help gather them. "Here you go. I appreciate it." Simple kindness. Nothing more, nothing less. Marcus smiled quietly. Months earlier, he might have searched every interaction for signs of suspicion. Today, he found himself noticing something different. Respect. Patience. Fairness. Not because people had become perfect overnight, because enough people had decided to become a little more thoughtful than they had been before. The cabin lights softened as boarding finished. Marcus rested comfortably against his seat. He carried no bitterness into the sky, only hope. He finally understood that justice was never measured only by courtroom victories, public statements, or rewritten policies. Its greatest victories appeared inside ordinary moments where strangers simply chose fairness first, long after. Cameras disappeared and the world quietly moved forward together. Marcus looked through the window as the city slowly drifted behind them. Buildings, highways, and airport terminals grew smaller with every passing second. Soon the wheels lifted gently from the ground, carrying everyone above the noise that had once defined his journey. Golden sunlight spread across endless clouds. The cabin became quiet. Passengers settled into books, conversations, and peaceful thoughts, unaware that one ordinary flight quietly carried the ending of an extraordinary story. Marcus watched the horizon without pride or resentment. The suspended partnership might someday return. Corporate leaders would eventually change again. Television cameras would leave. News headlines would disappear beneath newer stories. Even the painful memories would soften with time. But one truth deserved to outlive every contract, every investigation, and every public apology. Respect must never depend on appearance. It must never wait for expensive clothing. It must never ask about job titles. It must never require wealth, influence, or success before offering simple human dignity. A child across the aisle looked through another window and smiled. "We're above the clouds." His mother squeezed his hand. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Marcus smiled quietly. He hoped that child would grow into a world where belonging was never questioned before kindness was offered. A world where curiosity replaced assumption. A world where fairness arrived before fear. The aircraft continued climbing through brilliant morning light. No speech announced the lesson. No applause followed the journey. None was needed. The greatest victories rarely ended with celebration. They continued inside ordinary choices made by ordinary people every single day. Marcus closed his eyes for a peaceful moment. The future remained imperfect, yet it felt possible. Far below, the city disappeared beneath soft white clouds. High above them, one lasting truth remained wonderfully clear. Every person deserves equal respect before anyone decides who they are. Always. Marcus looked through the window as the city slowly drifted behind them. Buildings, highways, and airport terminals grew smaller with every passing second. Soon the wheels lifted gently from the ground, carrying everyone above the noise that had once defined his journey. Golden sunlight spread across endless clouds. The cabin became quiet. Passengers settled into books, conversations, and peaceful thoughts, unaware that one ordinary flight quietly carried the ending of an extraordinary story. Marcus watched the horizon without pride or resentment. The suspended partnership might someday return. Corporate leaders would eventually change again. Television cameras would leave. News headlines would disappear beneath newer stories. Even the painful memories would soften with time. But one truth deserved to outlive every contract, every investigation, and every public apology. Respect must never depend on appearance. It must never wait for expensive clothing. It must never ask about job titles. It must never require wealth, influence, or success before offering simple human dignity. A child across the aisle looked through another window and smiled. "We're above the clouds." His mother squeezed his hand. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Marcus smiled quietly. He hoped that child would grow into a world where belonging was never questioned before kindness was offered. A world where curiosity replaced assumption. A world where fairness arrived before fear. The aircraft continued climbing through brilliant morning light. No speech announced the lesson. No applause followed the journey. None was needed. The greatest victories rarely ended with celebration. They continued inside ordinary choices made by ordinary people every single day. Marcus closed his eyes for a peaceful moment. The future remained imperfect, yet it felt possible. Far below, the city disappeared beneath soft white clouds. High above them, one lasting truth remained wonderfully clear. Every person deserves equal respect before anyone decides who they are. Always. The aircraft became smaller against the endless sky until it disappeared completely behind a blanket of brilliant white clouds. No cameras followed its path, no reporters waited beneath its wings. The loudest chapter had ended, but its meaning refused to remain behind. Across the country, conversations continued inside classrooms, boardrooms, airports, and family dinner tables. Parents taught children to ask questions before making judgments. Professors challenged students to examine hidden assumptions. Managers reminded their teams that policies mattered only when guided by compassion. Small choices quietly began reshaping places where silent prejudice had once survived unnoticed. The airline slowly rebuilt trust through action instead of promises. New employees learned the story during training, not to shame those who failed before them, but to understand how ordinary decisions could change extraordinary lives. The lesson became part of the culture they hoped future generations would protect. Marcus never considered himself a hero. He had simply refused to surrender his dignity. That quiet decision reached farther than anger ever. Contracts would eventually be renewed, executives would retire, new headlines would replace old ones. Time would continue moving without asking permission from anyone. Yet one truth remained untouched by passing: years. Leadership does not begin inside boardrooms. Justice does not begin inside courtrooms. Respect begins in the ordinary moment. When one person chooses curiosity instead of assumption, fairness instead of convenience, and humanity instead of judgment, that choice belongs to everyone. Long after every article disappeared and every broadcast faded into memory, the real story continued through people determined to see another human being before deciding where they belonged. Above the clouds, the aircraft completed another ordinary flight. Below, countless lives quietly carried forward one extraordinary lesson: respect should never be earned through appearance. It should always be given because every person already deserves it.